When building a PC, whether it's the first one you've ever done or you're a veteran at doing it, you're always faced with the same few questions. Do you go with AMD or Intel for the processor? Do you go with AMD, Nvidia or Intel for the graphics card? SSD or hard drive? And so on. You get the idea. Now, one of the biggest questions that I get asked comes down to the size of the case. Sure, there's an argument that a bigger case gives you more room for drives, bigger motherboards, coolers and GPUs, and Lord knows that the Nvidia 4090 and 4080 needs a pretty sizable home. But what does it actually mean for performance? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. With this Thermaltake Tough Power 1350 watt fully modular power supply with full ATX 3.0 compatibility, a Smart Zero fan and PCIe Gen 5 ready, my PC will have all the life it needs.
It's alive! It's alive!
To find out more, click the link in the description below. So one of the simplest conclusions is to say that bigger is usually better, right? Now before you get too excited though, we're talking about cases. Mind out the gutter, folks. Seriously though, a bigger case typically speaking would mean more space, more airflow and therefore lower temperatures. But is that really the outcome? Well, that's what we wanted to find out. So Thermaltake sent over 3 cases from their Divider series, the 200, the 300 and the 500. And they're all part of the TG Air Snow Edition range. So you'd like to think they have a big focus on airflow, as the name suggests. Now, as they are all part of the same series, while the shape and size of each model might vary a little, or a lot in some cases, the overall aesthetics are pretty similar as you'd expect. So taking a bit of a deeper dive, let's start by talking about each model and look at what, generally speaking, separates them from each other. So starting with the smallest, the Thermaltake 200 TG Air, which is a micro ATX tower that in terms of cooling comes with a single pre-installed 200mm fan in the front and one 120mm fan in the rear. Of course, this is just what comes out of the box, and thanks to a pretty solid level of compatibility, users do have a fair amount of flexibility when it comes to mixing and matching different size fans. In terms of case design though, this should be looked at as more of a cube, with dimensions of 364 by 333 by 425mm. So yeah, at the risk of being a bit obvious for those of you who are not familiar with this style of case, a bit wider than a mid-tower, but certainly significantly less taller. Then we have the Divider 300 TG, which is more of your standard mid-tower, with it coming out of the box with a 120mm fan to both the front and the rear. Now, like the 200 TG, however, this allows for plenty of scope for the installation of more fans in the future, and of course, also more AIO functionality, with up to 360mm radiator support to the front and 280mm to the top. With dimensions of roughly 475 by 220 by 461, however, it might surprise you to learn that the overall internal capacity is roughly 10 to 15% smaller than the 200 TG. Albeit, you could argue that space is perhaps better utilised overall in a tower rather than a cube. Then we have the Thermaltake Divider 500 TG, which is practically identical to the 300 in that it features 2 120mm fans, one front and one rear, and in terms of aesthetics, well, they do look practically identical to each other. A key difference, however, is that the Divider 500 TG is notably larger, at 530 by 230 by 466mm, making it not just slightly more spacious than the 300 TG, but also the biggest of the 3. Additionally, it also has the option for a mesh side panel, which we will be testing independently. Getting back to overall capacity though, it is for all intents and purposes about the same as the 200 TG, beating it by no more than around 5% at the most, which is what makes this test so interesting, because all of the cases are quite similar, but also quite different. Now, in terms of similarities between the designs, all come with 3mm tempered glass panels, and particularly so in regards to the highly distinctive split design on the side, which, I get it, some will love and some will absolutely detest it. Now, in terms of capacity though, while the 200 TG and 500 TG share pretty much the exact same volumetric capacity, the 200 TG is notably more limited in kind of what it can do with that space. Quite frankly, a lot of it is mostly made redundant to accommodate the overall aesthetics. The 300 TG and 500 TG, however, will easily handle 360mm AIOs and masses of fans pretty much anywhere you'd like, giving them the kind of slight upper hand. Put simply, despite the fact that the 300TG is notably smaller in capacity to the 200TG, in terms of direct functionality, you should only really be picking the 200TG just for the aesthetics. Because although we're yet to get into any of our testing, any features beyond this point definitely tip heavily in favour of the traditional mid-tower designs. Not to mention, of course, that the 200TG only supports mini ITX or micro ATX motherboards. So for those of you unaware of what this means, if your motherboard is bigger than 9 inches by 9 inches, it won't fit in the Divider 200. So putting all that to one side though, the real purpose of this is to see which size case offers you the best overall cooling and airflow. And in this regards, this is clearly going to be an interesting one. Now in terms of capacity, the 300TG is the smallest, whereas the 200TG and 500TG are larger, but in kind of very different ways. Not to mention that the 200TG has a larger 200mm front intake fan, which should, at least in theory, move more air. But then the 500TG has faster fans. Yeah, in a nutshell, we have no idea of which of these are going to be the best performer in terms of airflow. But hey, that's what these videos are all about. And no, while these cases would all clearly benefit from some tweaking, we're approaching this purely from an out-of-the-box performance standpoint, and frankly, I just built in this just to sort of show you what it looks like. I'll freely admit that if I was going to, go out and build a gaming PC in any of these cases, I'd probably swap or at least add in more fans. Not necessarily for performance, but more from the point of view of eye candy, RGB and all of that. Again though, out of the box, what does the Thermaltake TG series offer when we throw some components into it? Well, to test, we used all of the same components in every single case. And if you want to find out more about our kind of testing for cases and the methodology behind it, then definitely check out the link below where you can find out all of that good stuff. So starting things off with looking at the all-important CPU test, where all cases managed to keep things at bay, though the Divider 200 threw up some pretty interesting results with the lowest load temperature, though the 500TG Air with its mesh panel gave significantly better idle temperatures. As we move on to the GPU, the idle temperatures on all cases were around the same, and then again at load, the Divider 200 gave the best results by around 6% compared to the 500TG with its mesh panel installed. It's really starting to show that the 200 may be the best, though if you want a bit more space, then the 500 with its mesh panel may be the better option. For our SSD temperature at idle, the only one that fell short was the Divider 200, where it just had a lack of airflow to the M.2 drive, while at load, all cases performed nigh on identically, with only a degree between all of them. Then when looking at our chipset temperature, again the Divider 200 fell short at idle but regained its top place at load, with the next best case being the Divider 500TG, though it was still around 3% warmer at load than the Divider 200, and that mesh panel made no difference in this test, though it was actually warmer at idle. Moving on to gaming, and during our Metro Exodus run, we find that the CPU temperature fared better with the Divider 500TG with the included mesh side, and the 200 actually came in last on this one. So yeah, things changed up just a little bit. The GPU temperature then saw some results change around, with the Divider 200TG Air now coming in as the best for GPU temperature, by quite some margin as well, while all of the other cases came in around the same, but obviously do accept larger components, so that's a choice you'd have to make. The SSD temperature during gaming saw our highest results on the Divider 500 at 53 degrees, while the 300TG Air came out on top with the lowest temperature, though this was very close to the Divider 500 with the mesh panel. Lastly, on the chipset temperature, again the mesh side panel with the Divider 500 makes a small difference, but the Divider 200TG Air again comes in with the best airflow, likely due to the orientation of the case and where the air circulates to in terms of the components. Having great temperatures is one half of the battle, while the other comes down to the acoustics and how noisy it really is. At idle and load, the Divider 500TG Air with its mesh side comes out as the victor, though between them all, there really isn't much in it, though the 300 comes out the loudest in both idle and load, and sat middle of the road in most of the temperature tests as well. So starting off with the temperatures, which case is the best? Well honestly, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer in one sentence. The most basic conclusion to draw from our tests, however, is that while all three cases are excellent, each has their own advantages and disadvantages. Taking our results as a whole and at a very quick glance, it does appear that the 200TG is the best model of the three, with it scoring the best results in the majority of our tests. But did it completely dominate the other models though? Well, yes and no. Taking a closer look at the results, we see that many of the scores by which the 200 TG wins are actually quite close. The only real eye-catching difference on the negative side of the scale are the idle SSD temperatures, in which the 200 TG struggled, for want of a better word, the most. So what about the 500 TG? Well, again, overall the results are very solid. An interesting point, however, is that our results do appear to indicate that the performance increased quite notably in the positive when the mesh side panel was used instead of the solid tempered glass. Admittedly, you enter a tricky territory here in terms of aesthetics and which design you prefer, but all we can say for certain is that based upon our testing, the mesh panel offers better cooling performance. But I guess that's a little bit of a given anyway. As for the 300 TG, well, this doesn't just represent a middle ground in the SKU, but also in terms of performance. It hits neither the same highs or lows as the 200 or 500 and typically seems to represent the most consistent performance. While the 200 and 500 TG throw up the occasionally eye-catching result, the 300 TG just plays it cool. It's not the best at everything, it's not the worst at everything. So the possibly somewhat unhelpful conclusion in terms of temperatures is that all three cases are great. But while the 200 and 500 TG do better in individual areas, the 500 TG seems to offer the best in terms of consistency. And not to mention the smallest footprint, since that case is actually the smallest of the three, which might indicate a better overall air pressure being generated from the two included fans. What about acoustics though? Well, when there's motion, there's got to be noise. Well, in this regard, the 500 TG is the clear winner. Again, no, we're not dealing in massive margins here, but with both the standard and mesh configuration providing us with the quietest performance, this case undoubtedly wins this particular category. This could even potentially be viewed as a surprise winner, given that it actually has the fastest stock fans out of the box of all three models. So, as we've regularly noted in the past, when it comes to this kind of content, we love it. We come into it with no assumptions, there's no right or wrong answers, we just test and see what happens. At this point though, you're probably wanting me to come up with a conclusion, a definitive winner. Well, sorry folks, but we can't do it. Each case, like the 500, or the 300, or the EBEQB 200, I don't know, has its own individual merits. But let's try and conclude with a key point on what we think makes each design great in its own way. So, the 200 TG. It certainly offers the most aesthetically with its cube design, and in terms of the cooling performance, it won most of the tests we conducted. The only downside is that where it did fall short, the other cases had it by quite a notable margin. Well, that and the fact that this is a small form factor case, meaning that you will be exceptionally limited on your choice of motherboards. The 500 TG gives you the aesthetic option of the mesh side panel or just a solid tempered glass, and in my opinion, and as reflected in our testing, keeping the mesh on is the smartest choice cooling wise. Definitely offers strong airflow and was surprisingly also the quietest despite having the fastest fans. And then the 300 TG. Well, as I said earlier, this is your solid middle ground. It doesn't just excel in any particular area, but it doesn't do poorly either. It hits neither the highs nor the lows of the other cases in this TG series, which by some accounts might make it the best choice. Admittedly though, I'm not going to lie that it is a little disappointing to see the 300 and the 500 TG come out of the box with only one intake and one exhaust fan. The 200 TG has a better excuse for being a smaller case with very purposeful airflow, but if you do pick the 300 or the 500 TG, consider getting at least another 3 fans for each model just to fill out that front intake panel a bit more. Now, while we did look at 3 cases from one particular brand, you'd like to think that this is going to be the same situation no matter the brand if looking at 3 very similar, though slightly different cases. And what was nice to see is that there was no huge difference between them. Maybe, I don't know, we've got to a point with case design where things have got a bit stagnant in terms of what it means for performance. I'm not a case designer or engineer, so I don't even want to delve into that rabbit hole. So what do you think? Which of these cases impressed you the most? Thermal take aside, what form factor of case do you normally go for? Cube, mid-tower, or maybe even something much, much bigger? Let us know down below, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. Something a little bit different. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get a ton of exclusive benefits like behind the scenes content, access to our super special area over on Discord, a monthly live stream that we'll be starting next month, and much, much more. The link for all of that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.